It's Game Boy World, and these are some repugnant reptiles. I built my professional career in part on my love for role-playing games, from cinematic cakewalks like modern Final Fantasy, to the punch-you-in-the-breadbasket cruelty of Shiren the Wanderer and Etrian Odyssey. I love them all, and relish whatever challenges they care to throw my way. But it wasn't always so. I liked RPGs right away, but for the longest time I found them far too intimidating to consider mine. I'd play them, but I frequently gave up before the final dungeons. Not because I was actually having trouble playing, but simply because I psyched myself into thinking I would. I played Final Fantasy VII up to the edge of the Northern Crater twice before finally going in and completing it, restarting those first 2 attempts from scratch because I didn't think I could win. These days I don't have that problem, but it took me a while to gain the confidence to feel comfortable tackling the hard parts of RPGs. Sometimes you just need a little time to come into your own, you know? And that, I think, goes a long way toward explaining Konami's Game Boy output in games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Follow the Foot Clan. Konami would ultimately put out some truly great Game Boy products, like Castlevania II and Kid Dracula, but it took them a while to realize that they could indeed make legitimately good games on Nintendo's humble handheld. Until we get to that point in the company's history, we have Follow the Foot Clan. In fairness, as licensed Game Boy titles go, this is one of the better efforts we've seen so far. It's admittedly not up to par with Batman, but I'd take this any day over something like ZOIDS or Popeye. Still, I had hope for something a little better, given that Turtles comes from the same team responsible for the excellent NEMESIS, the one truly good game Konami has produced so far for the platform. Then again, Follow the Foot Clan shipped less than 6 months after NEMESIS, which is a pretty short development cycle. So maybe its mediocrity has less to do with Konami's collective uncertainty about the capabilities of the Game Boy, and more about the fact that they were hustling to get it out the door. Follow the Foot Clan arrived at the peak of Turtlemania. The first movie had arrived the previous summer and had been a smash hit, and a new film, featuring Vanilla Ice, was well into production. The cartoon continued to rule weekday afternoons, the toy line continued to come up with flimsy excuses to sell kids slightly modified versions of the characters they already owned, and the still hot arcade game was finally due out on NES in just a few months. Konami wanted to jump in on the multimedia TMNT phenomenon before it began to fade, and Follow the Foot Clan definitely sold more than a few Game Boy systems. I don't need to explain TMNT, right? I mean, if you're watching this, then you're most likely of an age to take an interest, largely nostalgic, in the history of Game Boy. So you were probably right there in the thick of things, shooting your kid sister's Barbie dolls with whatever ammunition you could get to work on the pizza launcher. But here's the rundown. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles began life in the mid-80s as a black and white indie comic by Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird. In the beginning, it was a weird but actually pretty serious satire of Frank Miller's run on Daredevil, with a bit of X-Men thrown in for good measure, revolving around the adventures of 4 baby turtles who were mutated into humanoid form by the same chemical accident that blinded Matt Murdock while giving him extrasensory powers. The turtles were taken in by a wizened mutant rat named Splinter, taught the ways of ninjutsu, and battled against an evil warrior clan called the Foot. Somehow this strange little comic became an underground sensation, went mainstream, and turned into a global smash once CBS and Murakami Wolf Swenson picked it up to turn it into a syndicated cartoon. Konami more or less lucked into the video game license and turned it into a towering arcade success with a 1989 4-player coin-op. This, despite the fact that Konami's development teams had no idea what the hell it was. According to TMNT NES composer Hidenori Maezawa, the general attitude at Konami regarding the property was one of bafflement. Why ninjas? Why turtles? He once asked me. Heck, the first NES game didn't even use the TMNT brand in Japan. Konami called it Gekikame Ninja-den, or Legend of the Ninja Attack Turtles. But they made fat bank off of it, so they choked back their misgivings and cranked out some pretty cool games for this weird American cartoon. Anyway, Follow the Foot Clan was the company's 3rd attempt at bringing the Ninja Turtles into the video game realm, and it feels like a bit of a hybrid of the first two. It's the halfway point between the traditional post-Castlevania platforming of 1989's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for the NES and the three-quarters perspective brawling of the arcade game. Of course, you put those two things together, and it averages out to just a plain old belt scroller, and that's precisely what Fall of the Foot Clan is. We haven't actually seen a lot of those on Game Boy so far. There was KARATEKA, of course, and more recently there were a few segments of Double Dragon that went for a pure side-scrolling 2D view. But KARATEKA was pretty basic, almost entirely a one-on-one affair, and those bits of Double Dragon were only sections of the game. So TMNT actually stands out as something unique on Game Boy, at least for the moment. Alas, it doesn't do anything particularly innovative for the genre, which means it suffers from many of the usual problems you associate with belt scrollers, which pile up with problems you associate with Game Boy releases. Fall of the Foot Clan presents players with 5 different stages and 4 different turtles. You can select any stage you like from the outset, and you can swap turtles at the beginning of each new level, which adds a small amount of flexibility to the proceedings. Well, kind of. One way in which Fall of the Foot Clan completely fails to feel like its predecessor is in differentiating the turtles themselves. Remember how Donatello in the NES game was really awesome for striking enemies between levels of the screen? And how he had a cool enemy flip maneuver with his bow staff on the arcade? Remember Raphael striking quickly and efficiently? And Leonardo being the boring stick-up-the-butt Cyclops type that no one likes? Yeah, there's none of that here. The turtles look, move, and fight alike, with their only real distinction coming, naturally, in the form of their weapon sprites. The weapons all work the same and appear to have the same range and power, but they look different. And each turtle has a jaunty little walk animation where they twirl their attack implement of choice. But that's about it. Other than that, all 4 turtles approach combat the exact same way, with an identical standing attack, an identical jump kick, and an identical ducking shuriken toss. Unlike in nearly every other Turtles game ever, the 4 individual heroes amount to nothing more than extra lives, rather than presenting variables to open the door to alternate combat tactics. Lose all 4 of them in combat and the game ends. There are no opportunities to rescue captive turtles, as in the NES game, and there are no continues. There's a little bit of a missed opportunity here. The monochrome graphics of the Game Boy release take the franchise back to its indie comics origins, and it would have been pretty spectacular if Fall of the Foot Clan had lived up to its name by recreating the grit and atmosphere of the original comic arc. But let's not be silly. This is a product designed for kids, so it's built around the cartoon. That includes playing minigames against Krang. The usual Turtles tropes and enemies appear here, either as Zaku or bosses, Foot Clan soldiers, Mousers, Rocksteady and Bebop, Baxter Stockman, and of course, Shredder and Krang. They're all pretty underwhelming though, at least until they become overwhelming. Fall of the Foot Clan may have the dumbest, most toothless enemy design of any release yet on Game Boy. The Foot Clan themselves make the bad guys in Amazing Spider-Man look like devious tacticians by comparison. That's a wonder they ever rose to the point where they could fall in the first place. The bosses in particular are hilariously inept, moving in simple patterns and taking only a few hits before they go down. The first boss, Rocksteady, literally can't hurt you if you stand in a single place and swing your weapon rapidly. And they barely become any more difficult as you advance through the game. No, Fall of the Foot Clan fumbles toward difficulty the worst way possible, by presenting players with a tedious slog full of cheap ambushes and near impossible hazards. The first few levels are pretty much an instant win, but beginning with the river rapids of the 4th stage, the game quickly ramps up to frustrating levels of cheapness. The final stage, which of course takes place in the Terrordrome, is just a non-stop Macy's Day parade of BS. It's not that any of the enemies you face are particularly difficult, well, except the robots that take 2 hits and will chrome away from you after the first hit to fire a laser at you, but the game starts to spawn them 3 or 4 at a time, forcing you to attack in multiple directions simultaneously while avoiding indestructible hazards. The oversized sprite phenomenon is of course at work here too, with a cramped viewpoint that really hinders the gameplay. Sometimes enemies will actually spawn on top of you, and it's impossible not to take a hit from those. It crosses the line from interesting and fun to giant load of horse manure at this point. A big pile-on of cheap, tacky level and enemy design that turns a breezy, too simple game into an exercise in irritation. Somewhere between the two extremes would have been good, but Fall of the Foot Clan never quite strikes that balance. It's okay, but it suffers from the careless design of so many other belt scrollers of the era. Combined with a sputtery frame rate and cramped screen proportions, it falls well short of Konami's other TMNT games of the era. Yes, even the NES one. That was brutal, but at least it was interesting. The one area in which Fall of the Foot Clan manages to stand tall is with its music. Most of the compositions here were put together by none other than Michiru Yamane, who also composed for Nemesis. Yamane just nails it here with half a dozen solid tunes that often sound like they came from a system besides Game Boy. There's a decided Mega Man 2 sensibility to a lot of her compositions, and the truck convoy stage theme includes a few passages that sound more like they're coming from an arcade board's FM synthesis module than from Game Boy. It's really great stuff. Even if the game is forgettable, its music is worth a listen. Anyway, like a lot of early Game Boy releases, Fall of the Foot Clan is merely okay, and it would be eclipsed by later works in the same franchise. We're a long way from the spectacular Metroidvania ambition of TMNT 3 though, so for now please muddle through this cheap, unimaginative turtle take on Kung Fu and Vigilante. Next time on Game Boy World, some kind of like anime or something, I don't know.